Hey, welcome back to another episode of Ecommerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, and today we have a very interesting guest on, Lamise from Zoovu. Lamise, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Nathan, thanks for having me.
I know most of your audience is US based, and a lot of them probably aren't familiar with Zoovu. So let's start there because I know you're based in London and calling in from London, which I know a lot of people, especially our listeners, would probably rather be in London. But let's learn more just about you and Zoovu.
Sure. So Zoovu as a company, we're an AI product discovery platform. So we're a SaaS company. And really our mission is to connect our customers to their end customers by surfacing the right product for their needs in the most seamless way. And really the reason that we exist is I'm sure we're all familiar with that concept of shopping online and the choice paralysis that exists when trying to purchase something online. So it could be a laptop, it could be a washing machine, maybe even a bike. But actually, we are overloaded with the amount of choice that's being served to us. And as consumers, we don't have the right navigation skills or guidance or expertise, quite frankly, to be able to identify what is the right product for our need, which is somewhat dissimilar to an in-store salesperson where they're product experts. You go into a store and you can expect to have a great experience with a salesperson. They know their products like the back of their hand, and they'll hear, okay, you're here looking for a laptop. You travel a lot. You like to store everything on your laptop, and you're going to be using this for work. Okay, I can direct you to, you know, this amount of RAM, this much CPU, and the customer doesn't have to know any of that technical specifications. And that's really the power of what Zoovu does. We take all of that technical specification from the product data and we humanize it. We turn it into an intelligent set of product data that you can use to create a series of discovery experiences on your commerce platform. So we work with like the likes of Dyson, Amazon, Microsoft, and that's obviously from a B2C standpoint. And then something that we're super excited about, and like we can kind of get into a bit later, is the B2B side of things. It's so ripe for revolution. And I have said it a lot in other podcasts and blogs and things, but B2B organizations are really at a fork in the road. And if they don't make the moves now, if they continue to stand still out of fear of digitization, of AI, of any of those things, they will unfortunately not only fail, well, they won't only fall behind, but they will absolutely fail.
Wow, that was a lot to digest, and it's pretty yeah, everything that Zoovu does. I'm curious, let's start with a use case, right? Because I think a lot
Yep.
of people are familiar with Dyson, right? And so Dyson comes to Zoovu, they say, hey, we've got a problem of presenting our product to our customers.
Mm.
Zoovu then enables them to do that better. And let's kind of dive into that use case, right? Because I think a lot of our listeners, they probably run on, Shopify or maybe
Hmm.
WooCommerce, but for the most part, Shopify. And so let's say they aspire to be a Dyson, right? And so, how is Zoovu going to help them get there? Let's kind of break that down a little bit
Mm.
for our listeners.
So if I'm Dyson and I'm in the vacuum category, let's just say, and I have a series of vacuums that I'm looking to sell to the customer, but actually dependent on the customer type, on the buyer, there's going to be a right vacuum for that individual, probably dependent on their house size, flat size, what type of flooring that they have, how often they use the piece of equipment. And all of these things need to be taken into consideration when buying such an expensive piece of equipment. And again, if I was to go in store, I'd absolutely be asked those questions and have that kind of one-to-one experience and then be guided to the right product. But Dyson pre Zoovu didn't have any of that experience, that guidance, that navigation on their site, really. And this is to speak for all commerce platforms. If you don't have guidance or navigation, it's simply an index, it's a library of products. And with no navigation and no guidance, you're leaving your customers to try and identify and discover which is going to be the right product for them. And you're leaving so much revenue on the table by doing that, because ultimately, as we get into this digital transformation journey, and I like to call it a journey, not a destination, because it's ever evolving, organizations will be improving and they will be getting better. And those are going to be your competitors. So as they're moving forward, that bounce rate is going to become even more significant because they're not just bouncing, they're actually going to your competitors to buy. So it's really important as you start to think about your product assortment, that you are putting the customer journey at the heart of it and really trying to identify the pain in how they actually purchase that product. And the easiest way to do it is probably to try to simulate it to that in-store experience and then digitize that process.
Makes sense. That's awesome. Thanks for that breakdown. I'm curious because, if you look at kind of 5, 10 years ago in e-commerce, everyone was, really focused on native D2C, direct to consumer. They weren't really focused on this omni-channel approach. And one of the notes that you mentioned is how a lot of these brands, especially as they scale, they need to have an omni-channel presence, right? You can't just rely on your e-commerce site. You've got to have distribution. You've got to have, really a omni-channel approach to connect with your customers where they're at. How have you seen that evolve over the past, call it 5 years?
It's such a good question because it's something I'm really passionate about, especially when you think about Gen Zs versus, baby boomers, and the way that we shop is different. And so discovery now is not just going online and going straight to the brand website, because by and large, actually, and probably a lot of your audience as well, who have, shops on Shopify, their brand may not be completely well known just yet. So, how does someone discover that brand? It's typically on social channels. And so, what you need to be doing is meeting customers where they are. So, really starting to understand who your customer is, who those buying personas are, and then actually building your marketing strategy to meet them in those moments. And it could be TikTok, it could be Instagram. I mean, it could be Reddit, who knows, right? But you need to be really leaning in to those moments and then surfacing a hook, a conversation that leads them to that discovery process, because it could be the brand, it could be the product that they find on a social channel. And then what you're doing is you're funneling them through as a warm lead essentially to your website in order to get them to convert. And so we've really seen this evolution of the commerce website being the sole place for discovery, conversion, nurture. And actually, it's now spread across so many different channels. And I think that a lot of organizations are facing the problem of where do I put my money? Which horse do I back? And really, the answer to that is, again, I always come back to it, but it's leaning into your customer. You have to truly understand who's buying your product, who they are. And if you can understand that, you will know, it will be infinitely clear to you where you should be putting your marketing dollars.
That's awesome. I love that. I think you really got to focus on the data, right? And I see a lot of brands, like for example, Cuts Clothing, they just opened up a flagship store in Manhattan, which is different, right? Cuts Clothing was a very
Mm.
high growth and still is a high growth e-commerce brand that was focused solely on driving traffic to their website. And now in the last year, they've opened up their own physical store in Manhattan, which I think is a very different strategy compared to what they had, the previous 5 years,
Mm.
right? And I think you see more and more e-commerce brands looking for distribution either through big retailers or through their own retail channels. And I think, it's interesting to see how you were mentioning in terms of kind of cross pollinating or cross social, but then also how do you drive some of that in-store traffic or have that customer experience in
For
person?
sure. I was going to say that, I think the pandemic made everybody believe that perhaps brick and mortar would go away. And I think what's become very apparent is that there is still an absolute need for brick and mortar, just in a different way. And I think what we're starting to see, it's small brands doing pop-ups, but it's also the larger brands as well, where they're recognizing that this is all about the experiential side of the journey. And this is about retention. This is about lifetime value. This is about, it's so much more about your getting to know the brand than it is just about the transaction.
Totally. I agree. One of the topics that I want to, dive into is AI, right? Everyone's kind of curious, how do I use AI as a brand? How do I become more effective across my team with AI? What have you seen amongst the brands that you work with and how they're using AI?
So obviously Zoovu, our platform has had AI applied and weaved into it for the last 10 years. And so we've been in the industry for a while. And I feel quite privileged to have had that exposure and experience to the evolution and the growth of it. And I think, 5 to 7 years ago, when you mentioned that acronym, it was like, oh my God, black box, iRobot's going to pop out. What's going to happen. And I think people have now started to understand a little bit more what AI actually is, which ultimately is a series of data models that continuously increase and then grow as those data inputs also increase. And so I think with that in mind, really for us, it's never so much about where can I use AI. It's actually saying, how can I help either my customer journey to get them to satisfaction or to the product that they need, and where are those pain points in that journey? Where is the friction? And then how can I use AI applied to that problem to make it more efficient and to solve it? And that's what we're starting to see with the brands, retailers, and manufacturers that come to work with us. We have a problem building quotes. Our products are relatively complex. They require tons of compatibilities. There's a lot of compliance at play here. And on average, it will take us 90 minutes over the phone with a salesperson to build a quote. Can you help us? Yes, we absolutely can. And it's those type of experiences where AI and digitizing your sales process really, really comes into play. And you start to see the reward for these companies where you're increasing productivity. There's a huge amount of cost savings because there's no more manual inputs. You're reducing returns. All of this stuff really starts to happen when you're optimizing a process that wasn't efficient and now can be with AI.
Makes sense. I think one of the coolest ways I've seen AI used amongst e-commerce brands is being able to test products before they're actually launched. So sometimes they'll use an AI design tool to say, hey, should we do this with our product, or should we create this variation? And they'll test it, on their website before it really is launched. And then if it gets good traction, they'll say, hey, these are pre-orders, we'll go out and actually manufacture that product, which is a really, I think, unique way of even testing a product without a sample and just testing it based on a rendering through AI that looks super realistic. And also from a marketing angle, it enables you to be very dynamic with your creative in terms of testing creative. Because, I think what we've seen for the most part right now, when CPAs have gone up so much across social, is that you need to be testing your creative as often and as frequently as you can. And so I think it's a really unique way to, test AI and use AI on the front end, but also on the back end of your business, especially when you're talking about, reducing sales overhead and customer service costs and all of the kind of back end functions that are really important for e-commerce business. I'm curious because a lot of the brands that are listening, they're probably sub 100 million in revenue. And it seems like a lot of the brands that use Zoovu are maybe 100 plus million in revenue. What have you seen, in terms of these brands that get to that, $100+ million a year mark or more, as, what separates them from a brand that's smaller that's trying to grow? Is it just time? Is it some sort of, sales function or process? Is it some sort of, omni-channel approach? I mean, Zuvu's been around for 10 years. I'm sure they've seen brands that started with them go from, 10 million to 50 to now, hundreds of millions. And so I'm curious from your perspective and your team's perspective, what do you think separates these brands that are generating, $100+ million a year in revenue?
I think that the big boys in the market have been around for a long time, and they have got the luxury of the huge marketing machines behind them, the huge levels of financial backing that they have behind them. But that's not to say that the smaller SMEs and the new emerging brands that are coming through can't compete. And I actually think that now more than ever is the time to have that moment and to be competing. I look at brands like a Sweaty Betty, for example, in the fashion space, or like a Lululemon, even a Nike, quite honestly, versus a small brand. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them in the US, but in the UK and Europe, she's relatively quite big. It's a brand called Tala. And, she got her Series A investment, but she has dominated the activewear space, really in the UK and in Europe, because she's really understood her audience and she's really understood how to serve them in the right way through her products. And I think that if you can really get to know your customers, your audience, and serve them, that's your unique advantage versus the big guys who, at this stage, you become a bit desensitized to who your customer is. You don't care about Sally who lives in that cottage out in the Cotswolds, or Nathan who lives in Utah. But actually, these smaller brands do care, and they want to connect with you, and they want you to feel as great as you are. And that means there's lifetime value in that customer. There's repeat custom. And so, as I say, now more than ever is that time to lean in and compete by really understanding your customer.
That's awesome. I love that. Lames, thanks for coming on E-Commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify. If people want to get in touch or follow you or learn more about Zoovu, where can they find you?
Hit me up on LinkedIn, very active over there. You'll be able to find me with just my first name, Lamise, and surname, Butt. Or if you want to know more about Zoovu, find us over at zoovu.com.
Lamise, thank you again. And thank you everyone for listening in to this episode of E-Commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify.